Okay, thank you for coming. I'm Dan Runde. I hold the Schreyer chair here at CSIS. We're having a conversation about driving sustainable urbanization in Asia. It's part of a Bechtel sustainability series, so thank you, Bechtel, for hosting this. We had a very interesting lunch. We've got 4 very interesting speakers whose bios you have in front of you, and so I won't get into them, but I'll just reference each of them briefly. Sam Tumiwa from the Asian Development Bank, Kamran Khan from MCC, Ian Laski, who's with Bechtel, and then Rizwan Khaliq from IBM. So I think we've got a great set of discussants for this very interesting and timely conversation. I just want to make a couple of points, and before I turn the conversation over to our guests. There's 80% of the OECD countries, 80% of the people in OECD countries lives in cities. More than 50% of the world today lives in cities, and it's projected to go much higher in the very near future. There is a freight train of urbanization coming in Asia. There's a freight train of urbanization coming in Africa. When people move from a rural context to an urban context, they consume 10 times more food, water, and energy. It has all sorts of massive societal changes as well. Cities can be engines of economic growth and creativity, or they can be pools they can also be unlivable in terms of pollution and traffic, in terms of crime, as well as create the enabling environment for all sorts of other security challenges, whether it's radicalization or other sorts of bad activities that we don't want, public bads, if you will. So the future of cities, making them successful, making them livable, making them attractive, is one of the great challenges of the 21st century. We're not necessarily, in terms of international development, whether multilateral institutions or bilateral institutions or governments, whether it's the US government, fully equipped to think about this issue. There have been a number of attempts to look at this. I think Secretary Clinton's setting up an office of diplomacy with cities was a great idea and an important first step, and I think reflects sort of this acknowledgement of this incredible and important challenge. So without much further ado, I'm going to turn it over first for my friend Sam, who's with the Asian Development Bank here in the North American office, but had a past life doing energy work with the Asian Development Bank, among other things. So Sam, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Dan, and thanks for having this event and having us as part of it. We're very happy to be here. My remit was to talk a bit about the background and do the setting about urbanization, and I think given that Asia is really, as I said, the big explosion in urbanization, I thought I'd start with a few numbers to share with you. As I say, 6.2 billion people live in urban areas globally today. 53% of them will be in Asia by 2050, right? And so urbanization is going to grow significantly in the region. By the latest estimates, Asia is home to almost half of the urbanites now, and it's growing even more rapidly. And to keep up with this urbanization in the region, a few interesting numbers. 44 million people are added to city populations in Asia every year. 120,000 people each day move to the cities, and they require construction of more than 20,000 new dwellings, 250 kilometers of new roads every day, and additional infrastructure to supply 6,000 additional liters of potable water every day. This is the challenge of urbanization in our region. I had a little handout here. You can look at the 5 slides there, and I want to talk about the special features about urbanization in Asia. And I think the first slide shows that urbanization in Asia and the Pacific has been incredibly rapid. It took Latin America over 200 years to become 50% urbanized, to move from 10% to 50% urbanized. It's taken Europe and North Africa about 150 years. It's taken most of Asia less than 100 years to become urbanized. The little country of Bhutan, I used to be the ADB country lead in the energy sector in Bhutan, and it's become urbanized in less than 60 years. And so the issue of urbanization in Asia is a huge challenge because the countries are just not capable of coping with this rapid rate of urbanization. It's not like they're not trying. It's not like they don't care. It's just happening in such a rate that the countries are not able to cope. As a result, we have some of the biggest mega cities in the world. 12 of the 23 mega cities, these are cities over 10 million people, are in our region. And what's happening is that these cities are starting from a very, very low base. So this exacerbates the issue of the rapid urbanization because they were already underdeveloped, and now they're quickly urbanizing. So this low base from which they're starting is causing greater stress on the system in our region. Looking forward, because of this unprecedented rate of growth, we're going to see that more than 21 of the projected 37 megacities globally by 2025 will be in our region. So countries that are not megacities now, cities that are not megacities now, will be megacities soon in our region. So there's a lot more of this to come in the region. With rapid urbanization, the problems. We have growing inequality. I think it's much more pronounced in the urban areas, inequality between the rich and the poor. We have rising urban crime rates. We have the expansion of slums. And of course, the issue of pollution and its vulnerability of the poor to pollution, to flooding are the issues in the region. But if we're looking forward, there are some positive things that's come out of urbanization. Fertility rates in urban areas are much lower than in rural areas. We look at childhood mortality is higher in urban areas than in poorer areas. We look at
Childhood mortality
is lower in urban areas than in rural areas. We also see that there's a sort of a Kuznets curve, inverted U, when it comes to environmental degradation. Yes, environmental degradation increases, and we've seen this in a lot of the more developed countries. But as the country develops further, environmental degradation in urban areas actually goes down. So as countries move towards urbanization, the question is, how do we get from the current state of urbanization in the region to where it can be 2030, 2040, 2050? And the investments that are being made today is really going to drive where it's going to go. So if we're going to start investing in more roads to alleviate the congestion, is that the answer? Or is the answer, in fact, to design urban areas so that you don't need roads, so that you're talking about, the model that the Asian Development Bank is doing is avoid, shift, improve. Avoid the need to travel in the first place. Shift from private forms of transportation to public forms of transportation. Improve the technology that's out there for transportation and moving from fossil fuel vehicles, internal combustion engines, to electric vehicles, and that would help a lot. I think the decisions that are being made on energy, and in my job at the Asian Development Bank previously was to promote greater investments in renewable energy and energy efficiency. And the traditional model has always been, you have the large generation plants, you have the transmission lines to the load centers, and then distribution. Yesterday, I was at an interesting event at the State Department that Secretary Kerry was doing, and the CEO of SunEdison was talking about the improvements in storage and battery capacity from solar. And his view was in the next 5 to 8 years, you can unplug from the grid for $27,000. And the next 10 to 15 years, you'll be able to unplug from the grid for about $13,000. You'll be self-sufficient on electricity generation for your house. That would be very, very interesting. And if that's the way the energy sector is going to go, is there use in investing in these large generation plants? Is there use in investing in these transmission lines that take up a lot of space and aren't efficient? So I think one of the things that the Asian countries need to do is look at the technology. We're working with them on it. Look at where things are going to go in the future, so that the investments that are being made today will shape what these urban centers are going to look like going forward. I'll leave it at that, so we can have a bit more time for conversation. And on to Kamran.
Kamran, you've had a couple different lives that are related to this issue of urbanization in Asia. One is your current day job at the MCC, but also I'm hoping you'll share a little bit about your relatively recent past life in Singapore. So thanks for being here.
Sure. Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me. So yes, I am at Millennium Challenge Corporation, where I head global operations, and prior to that, I was based out of Singapore for about 4 years, where I set up and led the World Bank Group Hub, which was basically a partnership between Government of Singapore and the Bank Group, designed specifically to look at the Singapore experience and see what parts of that could be made useful to other developing countries, and to obviously provide advice to other members of the World Bank Group on project finance, public-private partnerships, and urban planning. And then prior to that, before private sector stint, I was with USAID, where I did urban development and was part of the project finance team there. So yes, been doing urban development work for quite some time, and focused on Asia, although at MCC we are global, and we have a lot of business in Africa, where urbanization is also a big issue. Let me just take maybe a minute or two to tell you what MCC is, to give you a good background. It's a US government agency, independent agency. We focus primarily on infrastructure. We invest roughly about $1 billion in grants in very few countries, about 2 or 3 countries a year. So big block of $350 million each time we go into a country. We focus on building large infrastructure projects, and we provide policy reform around it, so policy issues, and capacity building. So the idea is, A, get things actually done, and B, to have the policy around it to make sure that those assets are sustained. And then whatever we bring in grants, we raise quite a bit more, many times that, from the private sector. So you leverage private capital. We're very active in public-private partnerships, and the idea of combining grants and reform and capacity building is to basically ensure that we can not just bring private sector to a partner country, but actually help prepare bankable deals for them, which can not only stand the test of time, which all public-private partnerships do, because you put the right policy around them, but can, more importantly, be replicated. So development is not a game of demonstration projects. Development has to be a game of scale. So if you're not able to reach scale, individuals who are involved in it may feel very good about the great projects we did, but you're not going to really move the dial as far as the development trajectory of the country is concerned. So that's the MCC philosophy. Our mission is very clear. It's to alleviate poverty through economic growth. And the economic growth part is very, very critical. So this is not about just helping. It's about helping through a very specific, demonstratable process that shows that economic growth was created through each dollar of our grant investment. So that's MCC. The part that I want to connect to urbanization is that we select our partners through a very, very intricate and specific process. And it's written into the legislation of the agency. We follow countries' performance in 20 different policy areas, and we look at third parties who are ranking countries, like doing business or Transparency International and so on. And we look at third-party numbers and rankings of countries, and a country has to be above the median of its peers to pass a particular scorecard. We call these scorecards 20 scorecards. And out of the 20, it must pass at least 10 to be eligible for MCC funding. And once it passes, must include control of corruption and democratic rights, those being the key American values and so on. So we have, over the years, found a very good model to always be in the right country, meaning we find ourselves engaged with countries that are on the right trajectory. At least they're making the attempts to do the right thing. And those are considered the MCC partners. And that model has worked well. We've been in business for about 11 years. We invested about $10 billion. We have a current portfolio of about that size. And as I mentioned, we invest about $1 billion a year. And we have our own hurdle rate. On every time we invest, we have very quantifiable numbers that we are accountable to, both to the Congress and to our partners, that to show that economic growth is being created. And we meet our hurdle rate, and I'm happy to talk to you in the Q&A session about what that is. Now let me connect back to urbanization, particularly in Asia. So I think it's important to look at what's happening in urbanization by also including two other important elements. One is the globalization, which is basically not the nation states, but the cities are now driving the competition. And there is global competition among cities, and there's cooperation among cities, which is, I think, very, very important to see, because this is a new think versus a lot of the development models that are still stuck in the old think. And then the second very important element is decentralization, which, let me just explain the part that is more relevant to this discussion. There's the political end of this, which is also very important. But there's a devolution of responsibility that is taking place, certainly across Asia, where functions that the central governments used to be responsible for are now devolved down to the local governments. That has happened across the board, started in the 80s, has been happening. And I would submit to you that this is an area where there's a piece of this puzzle that is unfinished business, where a lot of the development community encouraged countries to decentralize, but kind of left one piece unfinished, which is the fiscal decentralization. So while these cities have the responsibility to provide services to their citizens, which they did not used to have in the past, the money required to do that, it still sits with the central government to a large extent. And so that's the part that when I was with the World Bank, I used to always challenge our colleagues in PREM, which is the economics part of the World Bank, that this is where you have not finished your homework. Because we encourage everybody to decentralize, but we didn't really finish the part about how would you deal with the distribution of income. So taxes are often collected by cities and given to the central government, and then the central government sends a portion of those back to the city. So there's a fiscal issue, there's a governance issue, which is, can cities be independently able to look after the needs of their citizens? And municipal bonds, how do you raise revenues? What is your balance sheet worth? Do you have the ability? Many years ago, when I was in the US Foreign Service with USAID, based out of New Delhi, we did the first municipal bond in India for Ahmedabad, which, by the way, is the capital of the province where Mr. Modi comes from. I remember the first time I met him, he had just become leader of the BJP wing that he leads. And we went through the whole process of introducing credit rating to India. It was the first city that was rated. And we structured the deal so they could get investment grade rating. And the biggest issue they had was the state government, state of Gujarat. And he said, how dare you get rated higher than us? And then, we had to deal with a political backlash out of that to sort things out so that the city could actually raise the bond. Since then, many cities have raised it, and the central government came down and sort of took away the loophole, which was the excise tax that the cities were using to guarantee the repayment. Now, Mr. Modi's administration, they've gone through a reform, and they're looking at this a lot more seriously. So this story has continued from city to city. I remember doing the same work in the Philippines, where 8 cities, many years later, 8 cities in the Philippines, we brought in the rating agencies. They got the rating, but then the monopoly that was created in the 2 development banks basically said that if you are a city, you can only keep your bank accounts in these 2 banks, which were parastatals, governments. And if you could not keep your bank account in a private bank, it becomes very difficult for you to then service the debt. It was much easier to sort of take a loan from these parastatal banks because they're sitting on all your cash. So, they're from country to country, there are governance issues that completely undermine the authority and ability of a city to actually be proactive and be the kind of city administration that you and I would like our cities to be. So I just wanted to submit that there's some serious work to be done on reform, on this sort of the political economy of center versus local government, that if we don't fix that, folks like this, the private sector who are willing to partner with these cities, can't really do that if your counterpart doesn't have the authority to do deals with you and play ball. At some point, you have to keep going back to the central government for some kind of counter guarantee. Second point I wanted to just put on the table is that of capacity. So you have, with competition comes divergence of capacity, and we all need to be comfortable with it. The development community, in the past has directed funds towards need rather than performance. So I remember a long time ago working in Indonesia. We were working in East Java and trying to help different cities in East Java, and there were red cities and blue cities, and not the US red and blue. So the red ones were classified as the poor ones, and the blue ones were classified as the not so poor ones. And we were trying to do microfinance and so on. And there was such a strong interest to only help the red cities. And I kept saying, why not? Why shouldn't we be helping the blue cities who are actually taking risks, where political leaders are taking risk and going down a very tough path? They're the ones who deserve the most help. But that's a philosophical question that as a community, both in the development space and in the private sector, people have to get comfortable with it, and citizens have to get comfortable with it. If your city is a red state, a red city, and it's not really making the right moves, maybe you ought to move to a blue place and get a job there. But anyway, that we all as citizens will have to get comfortable with it. And with that comes the ability to plan. So if you are not proactive as a city and you don't have the capacity, chances are you're not planning well for your future. And when you talk about rural to urban migration, there's nothing more critical than planning. If you don't have a plan, you don't have a chance whatsoever because of the numbers. Third thing, we don't talk enough about within the development community, which is art, culture, and what I call the branding, the branding of a city. There's something, like when you look at developed economies, when you look at, what is the branding for Pittsburgh? What is the branding for Cleveland? They used to be branding. Now they're all associated with sports franchises and so on. But this is a beautiful part of urbanization. What is the culture of a particular city, the cuisine, the art, the music? I hope that doesn't get lost, because that is someday going to be what drives value for that particular city. And if there's one thing that I think that China has handled urbanization issues probably better than many countries, but in this area they have completely done a very, very bad job. Because that branding really has gotten lost. The beauty of an urban conglomeration is the soft side of that. And if that goes away, like Bandung, what would Bandung be without culture? What would many of these cities be if you lost that? And I think the worry right now is that as they try to deal with these urbanization rates, it's all about numbers, building X number of houses and X number of roads, kilometers of roads and so on. And in that, if we lost the culture, that'd be a real shame. Let me finish with one last, somewhat controversial, or at least a question mark. When we think about urbanization, we're really talking about rural to urban migration. And at our earlier lunch, I made the comment that just like climate change, this debate never ends. I don't know why it doesn't end. We know it's there, the issue is there. But there are people who still argue. There's still an argument going on urbanization as well. People continue to feel that somehow policies should be put in place to curb urbanization. And people have been trying this for decades, and it hasn't worked, and it's unlikely to work going forward. So I wish that we would finally put an end to it and just say, look, urbanization is happening. Now, how do we help to deal with this? Most importantly, how do you provide dignity to these people who are coming in? And by dignity, I mean affordable housing, adequate shelter, of some kind, but education for their kids so that they have a chance, and healthcare. You notice I didn't mention jobs. And that's the question mark. Do you provide the services and let the jobs take care of themselves? Because they're obviously coming because they think there are jobs. If there weren't jobs, they wouldn't be coming. If you provide the conditions, the services that they need, whether it's infrastructure or other services, my 20 years or whatever, 25 years of experience tells me that jobs will take care of themselves, because if you provide the services and people are living in decent conditions, economic growth comes and leads towards that process, versus spending all that money trying to create artificial jobs, and then to have people working and living in sort of object poverty and without dignity. That kills that branding, that kills any kind of planning ability, and it keeps you very, very poor. I'll just say that it's equivalent to, your kids are going to, I have a daughter applying to college now, so I'm thinking this way. Do you spend all the money you have in your bank account to pay for your child, or you rather let them take a loan and have money to call them home and take them on vacation and buy them a used car or whatever? It's that kind of decision that cities have to make. Do you spend the money and your mind share on strategic planning and putting in the right systems, or do you create and spend all that money in one-way ticket in artificial jobs that are not sustainable?
Cameron, thank you very much. I think there are a whole lot of issues that have been brought up here. How do we make cities that are livable? How do we manage the massive urbanization change that's happening? How do we have governments that are capable? How do we manage some of the issues of political economy of the city versus sort of a federal government? But also, how do we have administration that's actually creating an enabling environment, not just for business, but for the things that make cities attractive and livable? We were having a conversation at lunch that there are a number of well-known cities that have become too dirty and unpleasant to live in, and so you're seeing people, expats, for example, migrate in the tens of thousands to other parts of Asia because of a whole series of different issues, but a lot of it has to do with livability. And so I think when we think about sustainability, I think one of the things to think about is what makes a city attractive. And so, Ian, thanks for coming. You have you get the prize for coming the longest distance. You were in Beijing. Thanks for being with us. You're the president for the Asia Pacific region for Bechtel, and we have had a very interesting couple hours together in the last couple hours. And so I would really appreciate if you'd share a little bit about who's Bechtel, and also why is Bechtel interested in urbanization, and how does that impact your day job? Because I suspect it impacts your day job in a very existential way.
It does. Well, thank you, Dan, for having me here. I'm delighted to be able to share some thoughts with you. And first of all, we've heard about the numbers which describe the challenge in Asia Pacific. I'd just like to add one more number to it, which is relevant to our business and sort of allows us to frame it a bit better. The currently estimated need in terms of investment in infrastructure in Asia Pacific per ADB estimates is about $7 trillion. Now, it's almost difficult to get your arms around a number this big. It's massive. Of course, this sort of number describes the challenges which are in the area which is extremely diverse, area which has cities like, or countries like Singapore, and also countries like Myanmar. So for us at Bechtel, when we look at a region like this, where we've been for many, many years, and Bechtel's been in business for 117 years, building, as you know, very, very complex and very challenging projects. For us at Bechtel, Asia Pacific is a known entity in a sense, but also an entity where we would like to still continue contributing. And I think that describes what we do at Bechtel. We're not just builders who go build and leave. We are looking at overall solutions. We are looking at providing something which makes sense for the local communities, providing something which is durable, providing something which builds our reputation, but also builds the reputation for the society and for the community where we operate. So I think when we look at Asia Pacific from this standpoint, it's obvious that that's the area where there are many, many opportunities for us to deliver value. You know, we've worked previously in areas where it required very, very innovative thinking. We're currently engaged with the government of Gabon, trying to come up with an infrastructure master development project and plan and program. Asia Pacific is a little bit more challenging in a sense that it's, as I said, very, very diverse. So there will not be one solution which fits all cultures and all locations. You've got to really be present in the region. You've got to understand the needs, and you start working with the local communities and the stakeholders to come up with bespoke solutions. I think, of course, you know, building infrastructure is a long process, so you have to be patient. As we've just heard, there are challenges on the legislative side, there are challenges on the finance side, and these are all prerequisites to actually going out and building whatever it is we want to build. When we look at infrastructure, we look at what I would generally term as built environment, but we also look at issues which are stressing that built environment today. I mean, the influx of people from rural areas puts stress on the cities. The infrastructure which underpins the cities and urban developments is also inadequate at the moment. And then we've got the added component of, you know, extreme weather conditions. And when you look at the Philippines, 2 years ago, the big typhoon caused $20 billion worth of damage. And when you also look at the other interesting number, how much of this damage was actually insured, it's only $700 million. So you've got almost $20 billion, for all intents and purposes, of uninsured losses. I mean, just think of the drag which it creates for the economy. So when we look at it from Bechtel's perspective, and we are a very, very global and multifaceted business. I mean, we are, of course, in infrastructure, in energy, in environmental and security, and mining and metals. All of these components play into our strength to provide global solution. And I think that's what we need to look at. Whoever wants to really engage with developing infrastructure in Asia Pacific has to be prepared to start very early, work with all the stakeholders, and we can't forget that in Asia Pacific, a rise of social activism is very, very strong. So the citizenry actually provides not just feedback, but provides demands, requests to the local governments. And, you know, they may not want a road, but they want to have reliable electricity supply. Well, how do we go about it? And I think all of this plays into something which we haven't yet talked about, and that is which are the right projects which we need to focus on. You know, there's been so many infrastructure development projects around the world which led to nothing. And that gives a very bad name to whoever is associated with it. You know, you have these, you know, skeletons of projects which were started for either political reasons or were great ideas, but, you know, commercially made no sense or were underfunded, and they just sit there like monuments to incompetence. So really selecting the right projects in a partnership between local communities, financing community, and people who are actually going to implement and execute the project, that's a key. It builds a reliable solution long term. It ensures that whatever is built makes sense, and if it makes sense for the local community, it's probably going to be sustainable long term. Now, we also have to appreciate the fact that the needs of local communities are not just in infrastructure. I mean, you know, the needs, we talk about the development, we talk about the growth of population. So infrastructure is just part of the bigger picture. So governments and local municipalities are constantly under, you know, duress to provide funding for various parts of whatever it is they do. So in many cases, rather than coming up with a brand new railway, we may want to think, how do we make what's already there more user-friendly, more resilient? How do we overhaul parts of the infrastructure? How do we add to it as opposed to just taking it out and building from scratch? You know, when we look at the work which we do at Bechtel at the very front end, you know, all of the master planning, all of the studies, deployment of new technologies, deployment of experiences which we've gathered over these 170 years of mega projects. That's, I think, that's something which adds value to the local communities when it's added at the front end. We build that relationship, we provide experience and solutions which have been tried and tested, and sometimes, we've seen what hasn't worked as well, and it's equally valuable lesson, what hasn't worked and what should you not be doing. So I think all of these elements lead for us to a point when we can actually say, yes, now we have a quota of projects. These projects are bankable, they make sense, we understand how they're going to be maintained long term, and we can then deploy our own resources from both the region and globally and work with local partners. The world when big companies just moved people from one end of the world to the other and built it and left. I mean, that world is no longer here. We can provide elements of support, we can provide elements of project management, expertise, of course, with underlying values of ethical business, of compliance, of transparency. All of this needs to be deployed to essentially enable development of local projects. And then, of course, when we see a pipeline of these projects, that attracts the finance, attracts the competent contractors, and we all become a community which actually works towards this ultimate goal. And I think as long as we do not have a viable pipeline of projects, it's very difficult to attract both the finance and contractors who will come in, because contractors, after all, are not in the business of taking risk, which originates with the municipality. We need to understand it. So we need to figure out a way of allowing a selection of projects which offer the acceptable risk profile to all of us. And I think the only way we can achieve it is, again, by working together, by engaging at the front end, providing input so these projects are structured correctly, so the risk profile is essentially acceptable to both the financing community and the contracting community. And in the end, we can start looking at a number of projects which will start rolling across the region. Now, again, $7 trillion, lots of these projects. Will they all happen? Will they all get funding? Probably not. We also need to look at issues like resilience and degree to which we should be imposing our requirements of what's a resilient infrastructure. If you ask ourselves here, what's a resilient infrastructure, we probably would say, I want my level of service to be unaffected, but no matter what happens, and I want to be safe. And is it something which these local municipalities can afford? Again, probably not. So we need to have that dialogue up front to correctly scope up the projects so we don't overburden the municipalities with our own ideas of what it is they need. We need to get that voice from the local communities, and then we can engage, and then we can provide experience from outside. And again, from Bechtel's perspective, we have the resources to execute these projects. We've got the expertise. We've got project management services. We've got technology, because, of course, to be in this business, you've got to innovate all the time. So it's technology which we use to build things, and it's technology which we use to assess the situation on the ground. And I think combination of these two technologies and, ability to manage big data gives us a good appreciation, again, of which projects are viable, which projects are executable, and ultimately this will give a reasonable pipeline of projects which we can all start working on. Naturally, the issue of financing, tax reforms, legislative framework, that all needs to be taken into account. So I'd like to just make sure that we're all aware of the fact that the $7 trillion is not going to be worked off next year, and not in the next 10 years. It's a long process, but there will be, I think, as long as we provide our experience, and as long as we provide some innovative financing mechanisms, we see a move towards public-private partnership, reallocation of risks from municipalities to contractors. We see a need for viability gap financing. All of these issues are now coming to the fore, and I think, last but not least, the question I'm very often asked about Asia-Pacific infrastructure, well, how can we globally compete against providers who are all about the lowest cost? Because what we're talking about here includes elements of additional costs, includes elements of spending which is not going to be immediately recuperable. So the good news is, I think as we look across the region, we see more and more local governments, local municipalities talk about best value. We're looking at the best value proposal. We're looking at cost of ownership. I mean, these are the concepts which up till recently were not really considered. And to be frank, World Bank also contributed to it by driving the lowest cost price. So now when we start talking about best value and cost of ownership, we are seeing that really presence of international contractors like Bechtel is not just desirable, it's also very, very likely. We can actually go in, provide best value proposals, we can work with local customers, and ultimately we can slowly chip away at that $7 trillion number. And as it becomes deployed across the region, more projects will be generated simply by enabling growth. I mean, the industrial growth is directly interconnected here. So I think that's what we're all about here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Riz, thanks for being here. I think one of the components of successful urbanization is going to require technology. We were talking a little bit about this, came up in this conversation now, not just in terms of making cities work, but also to connect leaders with people and the sorts of, let's call it the democratic pull or the democratic push of the citizenry in terms of the sorts of services and the sorts of expectations that they have. So thanks for being on this panel today.
Sure. Thanks, Dan, and thank you for having me. Right now I have the responsibility for IBM's Smarter Cities business, and one of the things I want to kind of hit on is, and maybe pick up some of the points that the previous speakers have hit on, which is, at the end of the day, economic vitality of a city, region, state is really built up by a number of different elements of it, right? Including what brand the city has. So I think something Kamran hit on is that at the end of the day, the way the global workforce moves and where skills are going, the cities aren't necessarily competing with one another at the local level. I mean, Pittsburgh is not competing with Philadelphia like they did 50 years ago. Pittsburgh's competing with Shanghai at equal level, right? Shanghai is competing with Bangalore. Bangalore's competing. The local competitive posture, and what I mean competing, I don't necessarily mean by attracting the next investment that's going to come in to locate in your jurisdiction. I mean competing for talent, right? Because when you look at the way the education system, especially the higher ed systems, as they're evolving away from memorization to access to information, this whole idea around big data is really transforming economies in the longer term. And that competition for talent and skills is what's going to separate and differentiate economies around the world. And so when Dan talks a little bit about this whole democratization of decision making, one of the things that I think what's happened is, and you've heard a lot of numbers here, right? 30, I have plenty of numbers I can throw at you, including, 2/3 of the global population is going to be living in cities by 2050, yada, yada, yada. But one of the key numbers that I think is really telling is that today, on average, there's about 200 devices that each individual is connected to, directly, indirectly, linked, whether they know it or not, that is generating information, whether they're going through transportation systems that are connected through the technology, whether the devices they're carrying on themselves, the information they're inputting, that data point, as well as think about the first thing most of the people do when you wake up every day. 80 to 90% of the people, they don't wake up and say good morning, honey, to their spouse. They'll reach for their smart device, right? Which is a terrible statement, by the way, to make. But that's a fact, right? So that type of pervasive acceptance of technology into our lives, the adoption of technology is presenting a tremendous opportunity. So when we talk about urbanization in Asia Pacific or any other part of the globe, one of the key pieces of it is that there is that bridging of the digital divide that's happening. And the reason that's important is because that's going to ultimately provide governments the opportunity for the first time in history to really provide bespoke, individualized type of services to each individual. And what I mean by that is the citizens are going to pull governments in directions, be part of the solution, not just be dictated to. That's going to increase. And we've already seen that. We've seen that through political movements that have taken place, but also where citizens want to live in a livable community. And that's, I think the livable piece is really critical, because when you think about economic vitality of a region, so IBM's done about 10,000 engagements around the world with regards to smarter cities, right? Whether it's around water, public safety, you name it. And one of the key pieces that we always hone in on that's difference between a successful deployment, implementation versus something that didn't work out well is a citizen engagement, right? The citizen engagement, in order for anything to be sustainable over time, the citizens have to have a sense of ownership. Because at the end of the day, the political leaders move on. They go on, whether they do a democratic process, whatever it might be. In order for any idea, whether it's transportation systems, whether it's a smarter water infrastructure, whether it's living in a social environment, the citizens have to own that as part of that discussion. So, from our perspective, for the first time in history, there's an opportunity for governments to really engage with citizens at an individual level through social media networks, through the data that's being generated by citizens, look at historical patterns, predict out what potential transportation systems need improvements without having to necessarily tear up a system, look at the system that exists today, whether that could be optimized in a different way, at the end of the day, with the goal of providing improved services to the individual. And we've seen this trend around the world. Sweden is far from Asia as you can get, right? So one of the first deployments we were involved was in Stockholm, Sweden, around transportation systems. And that was one of the most successful ones, because what the Swedish government did is that they engaged the Swedish citizenry right at the beginning, before they started to talk about congestion charging and congestion management and so on and so forth. Because at the end of the day, some could argue that that's an additional tax that the government's introducing into an infrastructure that citizens have already paid for. But they engage through a very open communication channel, whether it's through media, through social media, and engaging with the citizens, helping them understand that they're going to deploy this transportation system. They're not going to build more roads, but they're going to use the existing physical infrastructure they have, because one, Stockholm is a 1,500-year-old plus city. It's an archipelago. It's a bunch of islands. You really can't build any more physical infrastructure there. So you have to figure out what you could do with what you have. They have a very effective and efficient public transportation system, both in the bus and the underground. So what they did is they started to communicate with the citizens, because the citizens were so tired of sitting 2 hours to go 5 miles, right? And when you look at the Nordics, one of the big things that they're focusing on is they're very environmentally conscious. Not only was that 2 hours waste of their time, there was a tremendous environmental degradation price that they were paying. The particles from the pollution in the Stockholm cities were very high. The individuals personally felt responsible for lowering the environmental degradation. So when they communicated this out, and the reason it became effective and successful is that they engaged the citizens' feedback as they started to roll the project out, where the citizens ultimately felt like they owned it, to the point where now you pay 10 to 50 krona, depends what time of the day it is, you go downtown, right? Because they felt like that was a value that they're getting, they're contributing. And that's just one small example of, I think, some of the things that other places around the world could really learn from. Because the traditional policies of governments sitting back, or multilateral sitting back, or even private companies sitting back saying, well, we think this solution is the best, is not going to be a sustainable solution in the longer term. So the citizen engagement piece, I think, is critical, because that will then lead to this brand element that Kamran hit on, right? Because at the end of the day, when you think about it, we as human beings have a need to belong to something, right? We want to belong, whether it be Washington, D.C., whatever it might be. There's a sense of relationship we need to have, that sense of ownership. That only comes if there's a sense of social awareness, livability within a certain community. Going back to the citizen engagement and opportunity that exists there. Now, how do you get there is is, it's a long process, but there's tremendous amount of structured, unstructured, and I can, from a technology perspective, I can talk to you for hours and you'll probably fall asleep real fast, but the point being is there's a heck of a lot of data out there, both structured and unstructured. There's tremendous amount of technology that's available to actually take that data, turn it into actionable and preventive type of policies or projects that could be rolled out that ultimately provide a value to the citizen. And again, you can go from everything from a public safety emergency response solution to our transportation solution, which is a big headache all the way around the globe, to any type of a water management, environmental degradation type of issues that you're dealing with. Because at the end of the day, if the cities as they develop out and urbanize over time, if they don't look at this broader picture of, if I'm really going to develop in this area, and Beijing is a perfect example, right? Beijing, as expats in a private sector, when we had opportunities to go overseas for assignments, just like in most of the government agencies you go, Beijing was always on top of most of the private sector executives when they went for assignment, 20 years ago, right? That was a hot place to be. It was developing. It was growing at tremendous rates, and so on and so forth. Beijing's Olympics happened. Government invested billions of dollars into the physical infrastructure. So what the expats went there for 20 years ago, ease of movement within the city, mobility, getting from point A to point B, so on and so forth, has disappeared. Right now it takes you 2 hours to go 2 miles, 5 miles, whatever it might be. Huge impact on livability. Environmental degradation, you look at the pollution levels, is significantly higher than they had anticipated. That's having a direct impact on the city of Beijing, because the same expats that were fighting to go to Beijing are the same expats now that are exiting Beijing, because that's impacting their livability. They look at, do I really want to raise my family in a polluted environment, right? So at the end of the day, I think there's a conscious awareness that's coming into play where citizens are going to start pulling the governments in directions that they have to be prepared to move along with the citizenry. And that means they have to have a conversation with the citizens, and technology enables that. So I'll stop there, and I think we can dig deeper into
Thanks
that.
a lot, Riz. In our lunch, we had some folks from Uber, and it's the first company I've met. When you talk to the folks at Uber, they talk about, we're in Kuala Lumpur, we're in Barcelona, and they list, we're in Tokyo, or maybe they're not in Tokyo, but they go by city, and we're in 350 plus cities. And they say, oh, and by the way, we're in 60 countries, but they don't discuss themselves, or they self-identify not by the countries that they're in, but by the cities that they're in. And so that they see themselves as transforming urban environments, that they're specifically focused on urban environments. And it's related to this conversation about technology in the sense that linking up people and information, and somewhat in context of informality, and in essence, leveraging how people are living and where people want to go. That among many other companies do this as well, but this was sort of an interesting example of using technology to apply to, and many of you I'm sure have used Uber, so I think you know what I'm talking about. So I think this is to Riz's point. So I think there's a whole series of issues here, but it's great. Urbanization is happening. You're going to need, there's a whole lot of financing that's going to be needed. A lot of challenges in terms of how city governments can actually finance. There's challenges with how outside actors can work with city governments, just whether it's MDBs or others. We're not set up for it. There's some open questions about the kinds of capacities that city governments have, whether it's to make sophisticated decisions about infrastructure. It requires capable city governments that can actually have conversations and have an accountable discussion with its citizenry, as well as leveraging technology. These are all the sorts of elements that have come out of this. Finally, one thing is to say urbanization is happening. It's another thing to say I want to live in this city. I actually want to move there. I want to stay in the city. And I think this is going to continue to be an increasing part of the conversation. And I think in a global competition for talent, this is actually a real issue, and I think we've heard some of this as well. And I don't have to necessarily name other cities that where if I say a name of a particularly large city that's urbanizing, and I said it to somebody in the audience offline, they'd say, oh no, I would never want to live in city X. I think we could all kind of do a city name game and do that, depending on where you're coming from and what your interests are. But I think this is an important part of it. Do you want to live in a place where your eyes tear up with air pollution, or what's the quality of the water, et cetera, or do you have access to proper electricity, et cetera, et cetera. So I think these are all legitimate and important issues and are going to be an important part of the conversation. We were also talking about the issue of value earlier with Ian. And so one of the things that when we think about sustainable cities and livable cities is it may not necessarily be the solution that may be the best solution may not be the cheapest solution. It may be a solution that has a longer life cycle, that has different sorts of components to make the solution last, or to offer some sort of a better outcome than what might be the absolute cheapest solution. So I think these are things for us to ponder. Let me open up the conversation to the audience. You've all been very, very patient. I know there are a lot of thoughtful people in the audience. I'm not averse to calling on people that know about this issue, but I'm going to give you a chance to hear from some thoughtful folks. So I'd like to see some hands. Okay. Let's see. We're going to start. We're going to go from here to here. Okay. Mark, nice to see you. Here's the microphone.
Thanks so much for your time today. It's Mark Vlasic from Georgetown University. Love to hear from our MCC and ADB friends on actually country-specific, any thoughts on the challenges and opportunities in Bangladesh. Thank you.
I'm going to group 3 or 4 of these together. So this woman here with the red scarf. And then I want to hear from Alina, and then this gentleman in the blue and red striped tie.
Thank you for the opportunity. So my name is Monica, and I'm from American University. I have a question that how do you see the public-private partnership can reduce the inequality in this urbanized city? Because I see that a lot of cities in Asian Pacific countries, between the government and the private companies, they have like a lot of vested interest in both gaining profits and then trying to create a more sustainable development for their own cities. Thank you.
Alina, technology is great when it has a back and forth when it works, right?
Hello. Thank you very much for this thoughtful discussion. My name is Alina Zhishkovsky. I'm from an organization called Global Development Network, and we work with researchers in developing countries. My headquarters is in Delhi, so I spend a lot of time in India, and of course, urbanization is a hot topic, especially in India. So one of the discussions that we have, and one of the areas we work on, is youth and skills development. And I'm thinking that how does that relate to some of the comments that you've made in terms of the urbanization is tied very much with the youthful population in a lot of these developing countries. Thank you.
Thank you. Just last one here. We'll put these 4, and then I'll ask the group to pick and choose.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for all the insights that you have given us. My name is Nicholas, and I am from Marymount University. One of the things that I've observed while studying investments in infrastructure in Asia is that there's a clear correlation in the capacity with the environmental sort of conditions of Asia. I'm currently studying a very specific case, which is in Varanasi, India. And when it comes to water services, infrastructure, and sewage, one of the major challenges is the monsoon season. And I was wondering, it seems that the technologies that are correlated to this sort of service come from the West, where the conditions of the environment are not as extreme, if you will, as it would be during the monsoon seasons in India.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to start with Sam. I'm going to ask each of you to pick and choose the questions you want to answer, and I suspect we'll be able to get to all 4. But Sam?
I'm going to pick that question on youth and urbanization because I think it's a very important one. I think one of the, because it relates back to the point I made earlier that, yes, urbanization in Asia right now seems so dire. It's a lot of inequalities, a lot of bad stuff. It's very densely populated. But if done correctly, it actually could be good. And I think, if you look at Asia and in our own projections, by 2030, most of Asia will be middle-income countries. And we'll probably have 3 or 4, least developed countries, perhaps Nepal, Afghanistan, Timor-Leste. But for the most part, Asia, most of Asia will be middle-income. And if that's the case, then, in fact, urbanization is a very good thing because urbanization is the driver for growth. As these countries become middle income, they need to move away from being agrarian societies. They need to move away from natural resource extraction and commodities into the services sector, into the manufacturing sector first, and in the services sector. And that's where it has to go. I had an interesting luncheon yesterday with the former finance minister of Indonesia, and he says, the question was asked, if he was finance minister again, what would be the 3 things you wanted to do? He would say, conditional cash transfers. I forget the other one. The third thing was to do TVET, technical vocational education and training, because the countries with young populations have this untapped resource that they have not used, and to get to this resource, and currently this resource is underemployed, underutilized in these sprawling megalopolises, right? So the idea is that as you want to move towards the higher end of the scale, you need to educate and train these people towards that. And so I think that is something that countries need to think about a lot more, to talk about human resources and to talk about if you want to be here in the future in your infrastructure, if you want to see your society being here, what do you need to do with your human resources, with your youth, with your and the training and education you need to go to, and that's something that needs to be integrated into planning. So I think that's a very important part of what the developing countries in the region need to look at.
So I'll pick the question about public-private partnerships, and I'll break it down into 3 phases. I think for public-private partnerships to work, first of all, they have to work because no city, no central government has enough money to actually provide the kind of services that are required. But I'd break it down into 3, why they don't, what needs to happen. So one is the issue of authority, either direct or indirect authority. Does the city have the authority to do such certain types of deals? That's a direct. Many cities have the direct authority, but they don't have the indirect authority, which is, do they have the resources? Can they pledge their resources towards a public-private partnership? And that's a key issue in a number of countries. Second is capacity. Do they have the capacity to plan and then structure a transaction the right way? And here, again, there's a lot of misperception about what level of capacity the cities need to have and where they should invest the precious resources they have. In the development community, we sort of assume that every city should have all kinds of investment banking kind of expertise in-house. They don't need to. Some of the biggest players like the New York Port Authority probably puts out more commercial paper than any other organization in the world. They don't have in-house capacity. What they do have is capacity to manage investment banks and advisors. So we need to have a little bit more realistic understanding of what kind of capacity we want to put in, but capacity is the second issue. Third is business models. We're entering a new world, as you have heard. And perhaps nowhere more so than in the use of technology. So, you all correct me, but a lot of the technology companies who have the best solutions, they're not venture capitalists. They're not private equity funds. At best, they can provide supplier credit. So amongst us, there should be a private equity guy sitting here who is willing to work with these folks to say, okay, to bring smart grid into a city, you need to take a 15, 20-year bet. These guys don't have that kind of financing. They provide technology and they service technology. That's how they make money. But you need to have a third player in the middle who is going to partner with them and take the risk alongside the city. You don't see that. Even in the most entrepreneurial cities, you're not seeing it. Even in the US, the smart grid is still coming back and back as a public sector investment. It'll never get going. It's like a dead on arrival kind of concept unless you can actually come up with the innovative business models. And frankly, we as a community have failed to come up with innovative models for the cities that deal with the political economy within which cities operate. We know the technologies. We know there's a need. We know there is a long-term S-curve for any city's economic growth if they keep their brand right. But I think we're right now in the transition period where the models are frankly not there.
Okay. Ian.
Right, I'll take the question on applicability of Western technologies and technology transfer in general. I think it's a very good question, and you talked about water treatment and sewage treatment. I just happened to be in Taiwan 2 weeks ago when there was this super typhoon Dujuan going across. And in New Taipei City, they had 2 feet of water fall in a 16-hour period. Well, these are the numbers we're not used to. For us, 4 inches of water is already a disaster. But 2 feet falling in 16 hours is a problem. Now, at the same time, paradoxically, Taiwan depends on this water from typhoons as a major supply of fresh water. If there is no typhoon, there is a drought. So you've got to understand the local dynamics here. Now, when we come in with a technology which has been developed in a different context, it's often very difficult to essentially make it work in the local conditions. But I think the good news here is that as you look across all the technology companies, the presence in Asia Pacific of not just low-cost manufacturing, but of design offices, of R&D centers, has increased dramatically. So we have a cross-pollination within our own organizations, which gives us a better understanding of local conditions. And you can't just go by code, because code will tell you one thing, but without actually understanding what's the best way to handle it in local context. I mean, that's the key here. So I think the cross-pollination between R&D centers, which are located in Asia Pacific, our own engineering centers. I mean, we have hundreds of people working for Bechtel in Asia Pacific. I mean, like 600 people in Shanghai, 600 people in Taipei, 1,200 people in New Delhi. I mean, all of these people understand the local constraints, understand local requirements, and they are the ones who customize what we provide, and ultimately they are the ones who can drive this technology in a direction which will work within the local context. But I think, the times when technology used to arrive, nicely crated on a ship and would be just offloaded, I mean, these times are gone. Yeah. People know what they want, they understand that there are constraints, and these are very, very mature and sophisticated customers. So we need to be able to move along with their requests and provide local workforce which understands the granular level of application. And I think that's the answer to your question.
Riz, feel free to respond to any of those, and then I want to come back to Mark's question. So
okay, yeah, so let me, maybe I can pepper in a couple of the different questions. So on the piece of public-private partnership, I think from IBM's perspective, I mean, we are very much engaged with a lot of projects around the world. We do have financial capabilities through IBM Global Finance. We're one of the largest private equity entities out there that finances all projects and public-private partnerships. As long as the risk is there, right, the right level of risk, that's the key, and the annuity stream on the longer term justifies the investment, right? So from IBM's perspective, on the business side, there's a lot of appetite. On the technology side, I think there's a tremendous amount of shortening of the gap that's taken place. When you think about what's the cloud model is introducing, going back to, look at it very simply, if you want to build a new building and you want to add power to that building, you don't go and build your own power plant. So as a government wants to provide a certain type of services that's technology-based, why would you go build your own data center? Why would you go and invest multiple, not only build a data center, invest in people that are going to maintain it, carry that cost over time? Why not buy technology as a service? cloud is enabling. That model is emerging more and more, and we're seeing this. A lot of innovative governments really taking a hold and taking that to the next level. I do want to talk a little bit about the skills, because I think that piece is really critical. Because when we IBM talk about economic vitality or data-driven economic vitality, one of the key pillars that we talk about is really around skills development. IBM's, and this is not a unique growth Asia Pacific type of a problem. This is a problem globally. We actually, IBM's done something, we have a project called PTech, which some of you may or may not have heard of, with Brooklyn High School there, where we do the skills development, do mentorship and so on and so forth. And that's being held up as an exemplary, not only by the president, but a number of governors of what we could do to train our people to be more efficient and more competitive in the longer term. But I do think there's another piece to this, which is from a scaling perspective, what technology is changing in the skills development areas is it's truly enabling the education to take place at an individual level. IBM has invested over the last several years through this cognitive computing, which you may have heard about, Watson and the like, in developing some assets which really allow today teachers to teach individual students at their own rate, right? Regardless of whether it's in the US or anywhere else in the world, based on the historical learning patterns of that student, really customize the learning of that individual at that level. And that's something we believe is going to completely transform the education and skills development area in the longer term, because teaching to the masses is not something that's differentiating anymore. It's really learning and teaching at a personalized level is what's going to make the difference in the new skills area. And that's an area that I think where computing and access to data could make a huge difference moving forward.
Okay, just
Can I just make one comment here? The public-private partnership question is a very, very relevant one to the whole region.
That's right.
We all know that without a viable PPP model, it's just not going to go. So I just wanted to make a small comment here. If you look at PPP models, irrespective of how they are being structured in detail, they are essentially falling into two categories, either a demand model or the availability model. And that's all to do with the risk transfer. By and large, contractors are prepared to take the risk of availability. That's the risk we can control. We cannot control demand. Many local government and municipalities are still looking at PPP as a demand model. That's a huge problem. That's something which has to be solved by advocacy, by all of us working together, making sure we communicate that message that this risk transfer model is not going to work for us. Our understanding of the local dynamics of the shift from population from one location to the other, varying degrees of income, all of this calls for, as I said before, viability gap financing, and drives us towards a availability model, not a demand. Until we get this general shift towards more demand models, we are going to be struggling with PPPs as a viable delivery model.
so let's go to Mark's question.
Hi, Mark. We didn't forget. Maybe 2 points from ADB. When I was coordinating ADB's clean energy program, I was asked to prioritize which countries should ADB focus on as we want to increase investments on renewable energy efficiency. And I picked a bunch of them. Bangladesh was on that list, but I said Bangladesh should be a second-tier country because of the problems and difficulty with political stability, right? And it's hard to get into a long-term conversation about development over the next 3, 5, 10 years if that government's going to keep changing. And so I think that's fundamentally a big problem with Bangladesh. The other problem with Bangladesh is that you talked about the $7 billion number the ADB has put out on 7 billion dollars being the infrastructure needs for the region, so that if the region wants to continue at its current rate of economic growth. The other part of that report says that if, in fact, the financing that's available from the national government and the financing available from the multilateral investment banks, the bilateral donors, and so on and so forth, only meets 40% of the investment needs in the region. And then the other 60% has to come from somewhere. It's not available. In Bangladesh, it's even worse. It's not 60%. It's something like 80%. So So where do we bring that? So Bangladesh has a problem where you have political instability, and you have lack of financing. The model that should happen is really actually PPP, because you have the lack of financing. But for PPP to happen, you need to have the enabling environment for the investments. You need to have all that, and it's the right risk allocation. And currently happening, it's not got the right risk allocation. We've actually opened up a PPP center with kind funding from the Canadian government. We opened up a PPP center in Bangladesh, one in Singapore for the ASEAN region, one in the Philippines. And the model there is we take the PPP center is developing the projects. One of the things we talked about is that, there's a lot of projects that need to be done in Asia, and there's a lot of investment needs, but there are no projects to finance. There's no big bookshelf that you can go, I'll take this project and I'll finance that project. The projects need to be started from scratch. And it costs $10 million to just do the feasibility studies, to look for the financing. Who's going to do that? So this is what the PPP centers are trying to do. I think we are still struggling with the policy and regulatory environment. We're still struggling with political risk, but I think we're trying to promote, and I don't know if it's promote the PPP model in Bangladesh because of the huge financing gap. The other part of the PPP model is the capacity gap, the capability of the transaction advisors, the design and engineering companies, and we have to bring all that together to have a viable PPP program. So that's what we're doing to try to get there.
Let's take two more questions. Okay, so this woman back there,
We don't have a compact in Bangladesh.
and this gentleman in the tie.
Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Bushan Santavong from Union for Lao Nation, whose work is to advocate for democracy, freedom, and human rights in Laos. I see that our panelists speak over the to focus on the economic growth. But I would like to hear more, or I would like to ask questions on the other side of the situation. For example, the well-being of the population. Because, for example, the case of Laos, the public debt is more than 45 or 65% of the growth the national gross product. So that means the criteria of the loaning, the loan bank to those projects, it's past that already. So for example, when you talk about development in Laos and in its neighbor country like Cambodia, the development has meant impoverishment of the millions of Laotian and Cambodian due to the land grabs and systematic massive deforestation, due to the land grab of those, and then with the accomplice of the corrupt government. I would like to see if we do.
So, ma'am, if you could just ask the question, because I want to get one more question.
Yes.
Please go ahead, please.
So since we emphasize on the economic situation rather than thinking of the human rights situation, so the stability or of the region of that in Southeast Asia, for example. So how can we make it viable or sustainable for the population there? In the past, they used to be able to sustain themselves, but current, due to the mega project of the foreign investment, they found themselves overnight landless and destitute.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I mean, this gentleman here. Here's a microphone.
Hi, I'm Ryan Weddle from USAID at the Office of Local Sustainability. Mr. Laski had spoken about the need to make sure that development projects are responsive to locally identified needs and priorities. I was wondering if the panel could speak on the role of civil society organizations in advocating local governments on behalf of their constituents, and specifically the role that donor funding of these CSOs could play, either for better or for worse.
Okay, thank you. So I think there's two related comments here. One is about how do we have the voice of citizenry and civil society back and forth with those that are governing, and also how do we balance various important values of being heard and environmental management as well as economic development, if I think I've captured it correctly. So I'd welcome your thoughts on either or both of those.
Everybody's looking at me.
Yeah.
Some idea. I used to live in Laos. I lived in Laos from 1972 to 1975 before liberation.
As a child prodigy.
As a child, yes. Before I started working development. But I'm on your phone. But if I may,
yes,
Dan,
please.
my boss, Craig Stephenson, is here. He used to live in a small village in Laos called Luang Nam Ta, building roads there. And then he came back 20 years later, and I think he has some very interesting insights into perhaps both these questions on civil society. If I may ask Craig to say
so
a
it's
word
like
on
open mic night. So Craig, grab a mic. Okay, no. Actually, we'll give you a chance. Actually, why don't you just comment just briefly on that? It's okay. There's no such thing as a free coffee, Craig. So.
That's what to put your boss on.
Yeah. And you're going to pay for this later, Sam, I'm sure.
The problem is it's really a long story, and I think I'd better save it for another occasion.
Thank you then. Actually, then thank you very much. Okay. So but please find Craig afterwards in a corner to talk about the Laos example. But good, Sam, go ahead.
But I think the issue of civil society participation, civil society input, it goes back to the original ideas, several points here that, up front, before the decision is made to invest, before the decision is made on what to do, they need to be part of that dialogue. Too often the dialogue happens between the development partner and the government, and they decide that, okay, this is what we're going to do, and we go do it. The lesson that I learned very early on was that I was doing rural electrification in northern Pakistan, and Aga Khan Rural's development project had a great model there, where they went to the villages and they asked the villagers and said, what are your top five development priorities? I was an energy guy, and I'm thinking, they really need electricity. That's what they need, because if they got electricity, they'll have good lives. But oftentimes the villagers said, no, I first actually want water and water supply and sanitation, and then I want education, and electricity is number 3. Yeah. So if I had gone in and said, okay, well, we're going to give you rural electrification, and we'll give you solar systems or microhydros, that may be not what they wanted. And I think substantively the sustainability of that project may not have been very, very good. Right? The EU used to give away free solar PV systems to islands in the Pacific. And I visited these islands, and there was no economic, they had no skin in the game. So they get a solar PV system, and they would use it, and then like 3 months later, that battery would be in their fishing boat, right, that they use. So they didn't really take care of it. So I think the point here is that they really have to be part of the conversation very early on. Okay, Kamran.
2 quick points. I think that question really needs to be addressed one step up, not at the project level. There has to be a policy, a strategy, which goes to the issue of planning. So if you're not proactive, you haven't really thought through, and you haven't brought in the community in your plan and your strategy, whether they haven't bought into it, you haven't really given them ownership of it, no project coming out of that without that is going to really survive. There'll always be people who don't like something and who wanted something else. So if you don't have agreement on the strategy level, you're already in somewhat shaky grounds when it comes to a project. Second point I would make is we need to go beyond just advocacy and general voice going out. There's tremendous power in that, but I think we need to kind of be a little bit more surgical and strategic. And this is why I give you an example of the municipal bond model, which the value of that is that if you issue a bond in city X and you say, I'm raising this money to build Y or Z, then you have already created transparency in the process of you're raising money from your own people, and you're going to invest it in a project that you have identified for them. Nothing can be more transparent and create the transparency and accountability than something like that. So we need other models like that where they're not only just bought into the strategic plan, they are also actually investing even in a very small process. Some of the municipal bonds I did in my past, we included a retail component in the bond specifically for that. You could raise money from institutional investors, but you also want to raise it retail so that the citizens are actually involved in it. And we need many more models like that to make sure that it's not just about words and talking points, but there are some instrumentalities that are built into the system.
Okay, I think we're going to have to end it there. Thank you all for staying, and I want to thank my panelists. Thank you all very, very much. This is great. Thank you. Please join me in thanking the panel.